My name is Paul Heyman, and I'm the executive producer and the owner of Extreme Championship Wrestling. And since this show apparently is going to make air this week, I'd like to take this moment to thank you for watching the ECW.
Paul Heyman once named 5 wrestlers with shocking hygiene, and what he said about each of them tells you more about the wrestling business than any championship match ever could. Paul Heyman has a gift. He has always had a gift. He sees things that other people miss entirely. He looks at a man who cannot get a contract anywhere else. A man who smells like a back alley and looks like he slept under a bridge, and he does not see a problem. He sees a story. He sees something raw and real and true, something no amount of script writing or costume design could manufacture on purpose. That is the thing about Heyman. He built his entire career around a single belief that the most powerful thing in professional wrestling is not a perfectly rehearsed promo or a flashy entrance or a carefully tailored look. It is truth. And in the early 1990s, watching a bingo hall in Philadelphia, truth smelled absolutely terrible. Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW, was not a wrestling company in the traditional sense of the word. It was a movement. It was a reaction. It was a packed bingo hall full of blue-collar fans who had grown deeply tired of watching cartoon characters pretend to fight while the whole thing was presented with all the authenticity of a Saturday morning toy commercial. They wanted something that felt real. They wanted sweat and blood and chaos and noise. They wanted to believe that what they were watching actually mattered, and Paul Heyman gave it to them. His philosophy was simple and devastatingly effective. Accentuate the strengths and hide the weaknesses. If a man's greatest strength was that he looked like he belonged in a bar fight rather than a television studio, unless you leaned into that hard, you made it his identity. You made it the thing that made him recognizable from every other person on the roster. You made it his brand. And if that meant some of those men smelled like something that had crawled under a floorboard and decided to stay there permanently, well, that was simply part of the deal. If you are already feeling this story pull you in, hit the hype feature and give this video some hype. It genuinely helps, and it tells me you want more deep dives exactly like this one. Now, the story of these 5 wrestlers is not just a funny countdown of smelly guys from a different era. It is a window into a world where the lines between performance and reality blurred so completely that some performers stopped being able to tell the difference. A world where a man could deliberately turn bad hygiene into a psychological weapon, where neglect became a narrative tool that actually worked, and where, in one truly serious case near the top of this list, the absence of basic sanitation became a genuine health crisis that ended up in a courtroom and resulted in a verdict worth millions. So how did being gross become part of the professional wrestling game? And when does gross stop being a gimmick and start becoming something actually dangerous to the people involved? That is what we are going to find out today. 5 wrestlers, 5 stories, counted down from number 5 all the way to number 1. And Paul Heyman's fingerprints are on every single one of them. Before we get to the 5, there is something important to understand about the world these men operated in. The Philadelphia Bingo Hall that housed ECW was not simply a venue, it was a statement. Every show that happened inside that building was a direct argument against everything the mainstream wrestling industry was trying to be. It was deliberately unglamorous, deliberately raw, and it created a culture where the things that would have been considered liabilities anywhere else, the smell, the grime, the unwashed gear, the unshaved faces, were treated as credentials, proof that you were serious, proof that you belonged. That context matters enormously for the 5 stories that follow, because without it, these men simply look like individuals who did not take care of themselves. With it, they look like something far more deliberate and far more interesting. Let us start with the man behind the curtain, which because nothing about these 5 stories makes any sense without first understanding what Paul Heyman was actually trying to build. By the time ECW took serious root in Philadelphia, the WWF under Vince McMahon had spent the better part of a decade presenting fans with a product full of superheroes, big, colorful characters with enormous physiques, neon outfits, and catchphrases designed for merchandise. It worked. For a long time, it worked brilliantly. But by the early 1990s, a real and growing portion of the fan base had started to feel like something was missing. They had grown tired of the polish. They wanted something that felt less like a theme park experience and more like a genuine contest. Heyman understood this at a level that very few promoters of his era could match. He knew that for his product to feel authentic, it had to look authentic, sound authentic, and yes, actually smell authentic. He was not simply booking matches between 2 performers. He was curating a complete sensory experience. And that experience included the physical reality of the performers themselves, the sweat on their skin, the blood on their clothing, the smell that collected in the air of that Philadelphia bingo hall and stayed there long after the last match of the evening had finished. Heyman turned every bit of that into a brand. He called it truth. He called it extreme. And the 5 wrestlers on this list were the living, sweating, sometimes deeply alarming physical embodiment of that philosophy, each in their own specific and increasingly serious way. His core doctrine was this: if a wrestler's greatest strength was their raw, unpolished, working-class grit, then what might look like a weakness, a lack of hygiene, a lack of professional presentation, it could be reframed as authenticity, not something to apologize for or correct before showtime, something to amplify, something to celebrate, something to sell to an audience who recognized it because they lived a version of it themselves every day. The genius of this approach was that it could not be easily faked. The WWF could put its superstars in torn clothing and call them extreme, but an audience that lived hard lives could tell the difference between something that had been worn hard and something that had been strategically distressed by a costume department. Heyman's performers were the real thing, and the audience responded to the real thing with a loyalty that the manufactured version could never earn. That was the Heyman doctrine, and these 5 men lived it. Number 5, Vader. Leon White, known the world over as Vader, was one of the most physically intimidating men ever to step inside a professional wrestling ring. At approximately 450 pounds, he moved with a speed and aggression that made opponents genuinely uneasy before the first contact of a match had even occurred. He had competed extensively across the world, including a long and deeply respected run in Japan, where the style was built on stiffness, hard-hitting physicality, and an expectation of genuine toughness from everyone involved. Vader was not playing a character who was dangerous. He was a character who actually was dangerous. But Vader had a philosophy about his wrestling gear that went far beyond anything you would reasonably expect from even the most dedicated professional. Vader believed his singlet, his signature red and black wrestling outfit that he wore into every contest, should smell like a predator, not smell like hard work, not smell like a man who takes his craft seriously and trains with intensity, smell like a predator, like something wild and untamed and deeply threatening. And he acted on that belief through the simplest possible means, by refusing to wash it. Over time, the biological reality of that decision became impossible for anyone near him to ignore. Sweat soaked into the fabric through show after show, week after week. Bacteria built up steadily. Skin cells and other biological material accumulated in the fibers of the singlet. The gear that Vader wore into his matches became, by any reasonable or medical standard, a genuinely foul object that had no business being in a professional environment. Opponents who found themselves trapped in the corner with him during a match described the experience as completely overwhelming. The smell has been reported as something resembling death and rotting gym socks combined. Some opponents were reportedly gagging in the corner as the match was happening. Stop and consider what that does to a performer who is trying to do their job properly. From Heyman's perspective, this was not a professional shortcoming. It was a visceral and powerful enhancement of the Vader character. The physical presence of a 450-pound super heavyweight was already terrifying enough on its own. The sensory dimension that accompanied him into the ring elevated that terror to an entirely different level. And the smell dehumanized Vader in a way that even his size could not fully accomplish on its own. It made him appear less like a man who had made a career choice and more like a force of nature. Something wild, something that could not be tidied up or made presentable or brought in line with the expectations of civilized professional life. When a performer is physically repulsed by their opponent, the nature of the contest shifts in a fundamental way. The cooperation that underlies even the most aggressive match breaks down. It stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like something closer to genuine survival. Heyman's marketing of Vader leaned directly into that sensation. He wanted audiences to feel the raw and uncontrollable power of the man. The smell worked on the people who actually had to share the ring with him, even if the viewers at home were completely insulated from it. It created an in-ring reality that translated through the reactions of his opponents into something the audience could see and feel through a screen. Vader used smell the way other wrestlers used intimidation tactics or mind games. It was control. It was sensory warfare. It was deliberate and sustained, and in Heyman's view, entirely effective. There is also a broader effect worth thinking about. When word spread through a locker room that a particular opponent carries that kind of sensory reality into every single contest, it changes how people prepare mentally before the match even begins. You are not just preparing for a physical challenge. You are steeling yourself for an experience that your body is going to actively resist. That psychological preparation takes energy. It takes focus away from your actual performance. And Vader, whether consciously or not, benefited from every bit of that distraction. The opponents who complained loudest about wrestling Vader were the very ones confirming how effective the tactic was. Their discomfort was his advantage. Their gagging in the corner was his victory before a single move had landed. Heyman saw all of this not as a problem to manage, but as a feature to preserve. He did not want Vader to wash the singlet any more than he would have wanted him to lose 50 50 pounds or soften his in-ring style. Every element of the danger was part of the value. This was not simply a gross story about a man who did not do his laundry. This was a calculated assault on the sensory experience of anyone unfortunate enough to be placed across the ring from him. And it worked exactly as intended. Number 4, Bastion Booger. Mike Shaw, the performer behind the character known as Bastion Booger, may have been the most committed individual on this entire list. The others arrived at their reputations through genuine lifestyle choices that spilled into their professional presentation. Shaw actively designed and engineered his repulsiveness from the ground up. Before every single match, he made deliberate decisions to make himself harder to be near. Booger was primarily a WWF creation, a grotesque and over-the-top character built around the concept of being physically revolting in every possible dimension. Overweight, unkempt in appearance, slow and slovenly in movement. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward cartoon villain, and in its presentation to the television audience, that is largely what it was. But Shaw added a layer that the cameras could never capture, and that made the in-ring experience genuinely unpleasant for his opponents in a way that went beyond the visual. Before his matches, Shaw would eat unwashed radishes or cold pizza, not because he was hungry, not because it was convenient. He was eating strategically. He was weaponizing his own breath. His goal was to ensure that his aura, the physical space immediately surrounding his body, was as repulsive as possible to anyone who had to get close enough to actually wrestle him. Paul Heyman typically has little patience for characters he considers too cartoonish. The entire foundation of ECW was built on moving away from gimmick-heavy, over-the-top performance and towards something with genuine weight and credibility. So you would expect Heyman to look at Bastion Booger and see exactly the kind of thing he spent his career arguing against. But Heyman identified something genuinely interesting when he analyzed what Booger was doing. He recognized that the physical repulsion Shaw created was not just a visual gimmick. It was actually functional inside the ring. It was doing real work. Shaw's approach represented something that Heyman would later develop more fully in ECW. The idea that a performer's physical reality should be completely inseparable from the character they are portraying. The body itself as the gimmick, not the costume, not the music, not the catchphrase. The actual physical experience of being near this person. What makes Booger's story particularly interesting in the context of this list is how conscious and calculated his approach was. He was not neglecting hygiene out of laziness or indifference. He was applying a kind of reverse professionalism to the problem. Where most performers spend their pre-match preparation focusing on their body and their mental state and their awareness of the crowd, a Booger was in the dressing room carefully selecting the worst possible food he could find and eating it with deliberate purpose. That is a level of commitment to a character concept that deserves a strange kind of acknowledgement, even if the character concept itself is genuinely repellent. He understood, perhaps better than he ever got credit for, that discomfort is a powerful thing. That if you can make someone uncomfortable before the match starts, before the bell rings, before a single move is attempted, you have already won a portion of the contest. The heat that Booger generated in arenas was genuine. The audience's animosity was real, and the discomfort of his opponents was not the product of great acting. It was manufactured from a plate of unwashed radishes eaten in the dressing room an hour before bell time. In a business full of people who push themselves to uncomfortable extremes to get a reaction from the crowd, Bastion Booger found his extreme in cold leftover pizza, and in its own deeply unpleasant way, it worked. Number 3, Mankind, Mick Foley. Long before Mick Foley became one of the most genuinely beloved figures in the history of professional wrestling, long before the reputation as a hardcore legend, before the best-selling books and the mainstream recognition and the warmth that fans all over the world carry for him to this day, he was a young man who was sleeping in his car. During his early career run as Cactus Jack, Foley was not living the life of a polished, professional athlete carefully managing his brand image. He was grinding through a circuit that offered very little financial reward and even less comfort. He was doing whatever it took to get from one show to the next. He wore the same flannel shirt for multiple days in a row. He made no effort toward the kind of grooming or personal presentation that the WWF's polished stars of the era treated as absolutely non-negotiable. He possessed, in the blunt and memorable words of legendary announcer Jim Ross, the general appearance of a homeless man who had wandered into the arena by accident. That is not a compliment. That is an accurate description of a man whose relationship with basic hygiene and professional self-presentation had deteriorated almost entirely under the weight of the life he was living on the road. For most promoters, encountering a performer in that condition would have triggered an immediate conversation about cleaning things up before putting him in front of a camera. Paul Heyman looked at Mick Foley and made the exact opposite decision. Heyman told Foley to lean into it, not partially, entirely. Do not smooth the edges. Do not sharpen the look. Do not try to present yourself the way the industry industry has told you a professional wrestler is supposed to present himself. Look exactly like what you are. A man who has surrendered everything, including his vanity and his comfort and any interest in how the world perceives his appearance, to the pursuit of hardcore wrestling. Look like someone who has walked through wars that would have ended anyone else. Look like a person the working class fans in that Philadelphia bingo hall would recognize the moment they laid eyes on him. Look like somebody they might actually know. The response from the ECW audience was extraordinary and immediate, because what Heyman understood at a level that very few people in the business have ever matched is that the crowd in that bingo hall was not looking for heroes who appeared to have walked off the cover of a fitness magazine. They were looking for themselves. They were looking for people who had physically demanding jobs that left marks on their bodies. People who could not afford the products that made someone look polished and put together. People who were in the thick of a daily struggle that had no obvious endpoint. Foley's unkempt appearance was not a problem to solve. It was the most powerful and direct connection he could make with that audience. It said something very specific without a single word being spoken. It said, I am one of you. I do not care what I look like. The only thing I care about is the fight. One Heyman called this marketable bad hygiene. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Not hygiene that happened to be bad due to circumstance. Bad hygiene that was deliberately packaged, actively encouraged, and sold to an audience as a feature rather than something to be corrected. A presentation that was carefully maintained at its worst because doing so communicated something true and deep and genuine about the character that no amount of polished production could replicate. The flannel shirt that Jim Ross described, the uncombed hair, the general air of a man who had completely stopped caring about surfaces and appearances. These were not failures of professionalism. In that context, for that audience, they were symbols. The look said, this man has been through genuine suffering and he is still standing. That is the only kind of hero this crowd wanted. The physical toll of the career Foley pursued was real and significant. His body absorbed a level of punishment that very few humans have ever voluntarily subjected themselves to in any arena. The deterioration that came from that style was noted by people who worked alongside him throughout his career. The look was not just a marketing choice, it reflected a genuine cost. But from a pure promotional standpoint, Heyman took every element of Foley's unrefined, unpolished reality and used it to connect with fans who had grown exhausted watching a sanitized cartoon version of a sport they loved. Foley's willingness to be completely raw, in appearance as much as in the ring, helped clear the path for an era in wrestling that would transform the industry entirely. Heyman has described the Attitude Era as a carbon copy of the principles he developed years earlier in Philadelphia. And somewhere at the center of that story is Mick Foley, in a flannel shirt that had already seen far too many days, being told by a man with extraordinary vision that he was perfect exactly as he was. No changes needed, no improvements required, perfectly imperfect for the moment. Number 2, the Sandman. If Vader was the Predator and Mick Foley was the Everyman, the Sandman was something different from either of them. He was not a character so much as a symbol. He was the living, breathing, thoroughly beer-soaked embodiment of everything that ECW represented and everything that made it distinct from every other product in the business. Jim Fullington, the man behind the character known as the Sandman, arrived at that Philadelphia bingo hall every single night, carrying a pack of cigarettes in one hand and a can of Budweiser in the other, walking to one of the most iconic entrance themes in wrestling history. The crowd came completely unglued every time it happened. It was not just an entrance, it was a ritual, a shared moment between the performer and an audience that had fully surrendered to what it represented. But the natural byproduct of that ritual, night after night, show after show, was a performer who smelled distinctly and unmistakably of beer, tobacco, and accumulated sweat. Paul Heyman would not have changed a single thing about it. Heyman has described the ECW locker room as a smell you never forget. Not a pleasant smell, not something you would choose if you had alternatives available. A smell that was the direct physical result of the environment and the culture and the people who inhabited it. In that locker room, the Sandman was the central figure. He was the purest and most concentrated version of what that space smelled like, distilled into one man holding a cigarette and a beer and carrying absolutely zero interest in what you thought about either of those things. He was not trying to look like what the WWF had told wrestling fans a star was supposed to look like. He had no interest in the million-dollar presentation that the superstars of the era were expected to maintain. He aimed instead for the look and smell of a dive bar on a Tuesday night. A man who had been drinking since early afternoon and would still be going strong after midnight. Someone who owed nothing to anyone and intended to keep it exactly that way. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate and considered choice, and Heyman marketed it with precision as the ultimate expression of authenticity in professional wrestling. The Sandman was not selling technical ability or athletic excellence. He was selling a feeling, specifically the feeling of complete and in total rebellion against expectations. The feeling of showing up to the arena exactly as you are, with a lit cigarette and an open beer, and simply daring the world to have a problem with it. For the audience in that building, that represented something they desperately wanted to see. Someone who had refused to perform respectability for people who had never earned the right to demand it. Yet what Heyman recognized in the Sandman was the same core instinct he recognized in Mick Foley, expressed in an entirely different way. Foley's authenticity was about endurance and sacrifice. The Sandman's was about refusal, about the radical act of not wanting something that everyone else around you was chasing. The million-dollar look, the corporate endorsement, the sanitized presentation that required you to be something other than what you actually were. The Sandman wanted none of it, and the crowd in Philadelphia loved him fiercely for that refusal. The entrance ritual also did something specific for the atmosphere of the whole show. It told everyone in the building, before the Sandman had done anything athletic at all, that the rules of normal entertainment did not apply here tonight. That was valuable to Heyman in a way that went beyond just getting one performer over with the crowd. It set the tone for everything that followed it. The physical environment of the ECW arena deepened everything the Sandman represented. That poorly ventilated former bingo hall, packed with passionate fans who were not there for a corporate entertainment product, created an atmosphere that was thick and distinctive and unlike anything else in the business. The Sandman was the human version of what that building smelled like. He did not exist in spite of the environment. He completed it. The Sandman's scent was the smell of ECW at its most identifiable and most honest. But that same culture of discarding conventional standards, or the same casual relationship with hygiene and safety that made the product feel authentic, was about to show everyone involved exactly where it led when taken far enough. And that brings us to number one. Number one, Abdullah the Butcher. This is where the story stops being entertaining and becomes genuinely, uncomfortably serious. This is where the culture of weaponized grime stops being a promotional philosophy and reveals the real cost it imposed on real people. Lawrence Shreve, known professionally as Abdullah the Butcher, was one of the most discussed and most feared figures in professional wrestling across several decades. The character, billed as the madman from the Sudan, was constructed entirely around the concept of extreme and uncontrolled violence. Deep forehead scars accumulated over years of a practice called blading, meaning the deliberate use of a sharp object to cut oneself and produce real blood during a match, had become defining physical features of his appearance. A fork was his weapon of choice inside the ring. His forehead bore the accumulated evidence of those years in the form of scars so deep and so numerous that they had fundamentally changed the landscape of his face. Abdullah the Butcher is at the top of this list, not because his story is the most entertaining or the most colorful. He is at the top because his story is the most important. And it is the most important because it is the one that produced documented, lasting, life-altering harm to another human being who had done nothing to deserve it. Abdullah did not undergo regular medical screenings. Throughout a career that spanned many years and many territories, he engaged repeatedly in the deliberate production of open wounds and real bleeding without the kind of testing and medical oversight that should have been treated as basic professional standards. Without that testing and without proper protocols in place, he became what the research identifies as a high-risk vector for bloodborne pathogens. Not a theoretical risk, an active and ongoing one. It is worth pausing on what that actually meant in practice. Blading is a practice where a small concealed blade is used to make a cut, typically on the forehead, to produce genuine blood during a match. For decades, it was common enough in certain parts of the wrestling industry that it was treated as a standard technique. Promoters liked the visual impact. Performers used it to tell stories. Audiences often responded to it intensely, and almost nobody asked serious questions about whether the people doing it were taking any precautions about what they might be carrying or passing on. That was the Wild West mentality that defined the era, a culture where the drive to produce a powerful reaction from a crowd consistently overrode any consideration of what it might cost the performers involved, where the absence of medical oversight was not treated as a gap in professional standards, but as evidence that you were serious about the craft, where saying no to something because it was unsafe would have been seen as weakness. The consequence of this became a matter of public record through a lawsuit filed by Canadian wrestler Devin Nicholson, who competed under the ring name Hannibal. Nicholson alleged that during a match with Abdullah, a non-consensual cut occurred, and not something he had agreed to, not part of any planned sequence in the match, a cut that exposed him to Abdullah's blood without his knowledge or consent. Nicholson claimed he contracted hepatitis C as a direct result of that contact during that match. The case was pursued in court. Devin Nicholson was eventually awarded $2.3 million in damages. $2.3 million because someone did not maintain the most basic medical standards. because the protocols that existed in every other professional sporting environment, protocols designed specifically and deliberately to prevent exactly this kind of transmission between people who come into physical contact during their work, were treated as unnecessary by a culture that had decided danger was a product feature rather than a responsibility to manage. Only because the Wild West mentality of the era consistently placed the desire to generate a reaction above any obligation to protect the human beings performing in those rings. Paul Heyman built ECW's brand on the idea that his locker room was a place where anything could happen, that the danger was genuine, that the extremity was not a performance, but a real state of being. Abdullah the Butcher represented the outermost edge of that idea. And in Abdullah's case, anything did happen. It happened specifically to Devin Nicholson. And the consequences of that moment followed him out of the building and became part of his permanent daily reality. Other voices from within professional wrestling, including the veteran performer known as Superstar Billy Graham, went public with serious and detailed concerns about Abdullah and what he had represented as a biological risk to the wrestling community as a whole. The hazard was not abstract or theoretical. It was documented and litigated and attached to a multi-million-dollar legal outcome. Heyman maintained throughout this period a position of defending ECW's safety record while simultaneously marketing the perceived danger of the product at full volume. There is a tension in that position that simply does not resolve comfortably. Marketing the idea of danger as an entertainment product is a legitimate promotional strategy. The reality of that danger entering another person's body without their knowledge or agreement is not a promotional strategy. It is a failure of fundamental human responsibility. For it is a failure that Devin Nicholson and potentially others carried with them long after the match was over and the audience had gone home. That is why he is number one. Not for entertainment value, for consequence. Now, what do you do with all of that? You start with Vader, who turned an unwashed singlet into a psychological instrument. You pass through Bastion Booger, who ate cold, dirty food on purpose to make himself harder to tolerate at close range. You arrive at Mick Foley, where the neglect was genuinely lived, but the marketing of it was inspired and deeply human. You reach the Sandman, who turned the smell of a dive bar at closing time into a symbol of rebellion that fans still talk about decades later. And you end at Abdullah the Butcher, where the story leaves the entertaining space entirely and sits down in a courtroom with a $2.3 million verdict attached to it. There is one thread connecting all five of these men, and Paul Heyman is that thread. His doctrine of accentuating strengths and hiding weaknesses was applied differently to each of them. With Vader, physical neglect became dominance and dehumanization. With Foley, it became the most authentic working-class relatability in the business. With the Sandman, it became the flag of a counter-cultural rebellion. With Booger, physical repulsion was manufactured and deliberately deployed as an in-ring tactic. And with Abdullah, what began as an extension of extreme performance philosophy became extreme negligence with life-altering consequences for someone else. Paul Heyman, still operating at the very top level of the business, still shaping the trajectories of the next generation of performers, remains one of the most extraordinary and genuinely fascinating minds the wrestling industry has ever produced. His ability to identify the authentic core of a performer and amplify it to its maximum potential is a rare talent. His ability to take something repulsive and make it compelling is almost unique. He recently compared his current faction to the 1990s ECW locker room, talking about accentuating strengths and hiding weaknesses in the same language he has always used. The philosophy endures. The man behind it endures. But the real lesson of these five wrestlers is not that grime is good or that personal neglect produces authentic character. The lesson is that the instinct behind the philosophy, the search for truth, the rejection of artificial gloss, the hunger to connect with an audience on a level that actually feels real and earned, that instinct is genuinely valuable. It is worth carrying forward. The part that needs to stay in the past is the treatment of basic safety as an optional extra. The part where a performer can enter a ring with another human being and expose them to life-altering biological risk because nobody thought the standards mattered enough to enforce. That part of the story belongs to a specific time and a specific culture, and it should stay there. Wrestling is best when it makes you feel something true, when the effort and the sacrifice and the physical reality of what these people put themselves through comes through a screen and lands somewhere real inside you. You do not need someone contracting a serious illness for a match to feel extreme. You do not need a man carrying a biological hazard for a match to feel meaningful. There are better and safer ways to tell a true story, and the best people in this business have always known that. If this story hit you differently than you expected, leave a comment below and tell me which of these five surprised or shocked you the most. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay ready because there are more deep dives exactly like this one on the way. The smell of ECW is a relic now. but the lessons it left behind about authenticity and accountability, and about what we truly owe to the people who give their bodies and their health to entertain us, those lessons are as fresh and relevant as they have ever been. Wrestling has never been only what you see on screen. It has always been what you feel deep inside. The sweat, the sacrifice, the story underneath the story. Those things matter. They have always mattered. The 5 men on this list understood that, each in their own imperfect and sometimes alarming way. And feeling something real is always worth protecting.